Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of the Image Comics series Killadelphia, as well as the writer and producer of a ton of shows throughout the years, including The Boondocks, Marvel's Runaways, and American Gods. It's Rodney Barnes. Thanks for coming on, Rodney.
Hey, thanks for having me, David.
So obviously with that intro, you have quite the background in TV shows and Hollywood and everything like that. I mean, that's especially considering the fact I barely scratched the surface of what you've done. But I am interested in, after all of that success, after all that work in that field, not that you're stopping by any means, but what made you want to get into comics, like a completely different field?
Well, it was twofold. I mean, the first part was a lot of the stuff that I'm doing in comics, certainly the creator-owned stuff, were ideas that I couldn't sell as TV shows or movies. And I wanted to get the stories out of my system because they were just kind of lingering there and they had no place to go. The second part is I've loved comic books my entire life. The first thing I remember reading as a kid was a comic book. And they've been with me through ups, downs, from as long as I can remember to now. So, to do them was something I always wanted to do.
I love the fact, I was reading an interview you had done with, I think it was Sci-Fi, and you said in an interview that your comic addiction was so severe that you would beg, borrow, or steal if you saw Neal Adams' Batman or Green Lantern cover. And then Neal did a cover for Killadelphia. Like, that's pretty cool.
Oh, my God. It was the biggest fanboy moment. He probably could have charged me 3 times as much, and I would have figured out how to get the money. I just remember, man, as a kid, we had a corner store, the farm store in Annapolis, Maryland, in Eastport, my community. And I would leave school and go directly there. And comic books were like 20, 25 cents, 30 cents at the most back then. And if I didn't have enough money, I would do everything I possibly could, including breaking laws, to get those Neal Adams covers. And it's seemingly Neal was doing every cover of every DC book at the time. And I went nuts over it. I don't know what it was. And I still kind of am.
Yeah.
So there you go.
I mean, I get it. When I was a kid, I was coming up right as like Jim Lee was becoming like a big deal. And it was the same for me. They had, I think, 5 covers for the X-Men #1 that came out in 1991 or 1992. And I remember, even though rationally in my head, I knew it would be the same comic in all 5, I was like, Jim Lee did all 5 of these and they connect and I need all 5 of these. And, it's you have your person. And I mean, I am interested. What was it about Neal Adams that spoke to you?
Up until that point, I'd read a lot of, I don't want to say their names to disparage any artists, but comic books had been comic-y. Like, I wasn't a big fan of the Adam West Batman series as much as I dug it. I dug it mostly because there wasn't the other thing, the other shade of that. The pow, bam, whatever. That was all I really had as far as superhero stuff was concerned. And when Neal started doing his work, it looked real. It looked like real action. There was a sense of a connection that I made with it that felt like adventure. It felt like James Bond. It felt like it just felt real.
Yeah.
And the other stuff felt like it was for kids, even though I was a kid. I was just drawn to Neal's style of art.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing when you're a kid, the last thing you want to do is be like spoken down to. And that was one of the things about Neal in that era is, and even beyond the art, the stories that he was working on always were really grounded. They always felt very real and they were set in the real world. Even when you're talking about with somebody like Green Lantern, who's like, a literal space cop, it was still grounded.
Yeah, I mean, those 8 or 9 issues he did, the ones with Denny O'Neil that dealt with drugs and racism and overpopulation and every social ill seemingly of the time. They felt like it was more, how can I say it? It was a political commentary more so than just a comic book. Mm-hmm. And it made me feel connected to something. And I still, if I'm on eBay and I'm just surfing mindlessly because I have nothing to do, I'll still look for those books, even though I have them buried someplace, and I'll still pick them up like they're new.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of the nice things about comics. I mean, and I'm not saying that other mediums can't do this, but it is interesting. Like, you can have a vampire story, but you can layer in all these other things into it because it's, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that people often say about comics is, they speak to the freedom of the medium. Like, it allows you to do a lot of different things that maybe would be more difficult to do in TV or film. And I don't know. It seems like Neal and Denny were certainly taking advantage of that.
They were. I mean, I think Stan Lee did it in his way, with the X-Men, and it was sort of the stuff that was under the story. I think, Denny and Neal sort of, it was in your face. It was like, it was right there. And that appealed to the kid, Rodney.
Yeah. Do you, this is something I was thinking about when it came to your work, and not just your work, just kind of like the general feel of the world today when it comes to entertainment. Not just because of the MCU or because of other big comic book things, but it feels like there's a lot of common pop culture roots amongst creators of all types today. Like, whether you're talking about movies, TV, wherever. And it feels like comics are a big part of that language. And I think it's interesting looking at your some of the shows you've worked on where you're talking about like Boondocks, which is based on a comic strip, or Runaways, which is based on a comic, or American Gods, which is, based on a series written by Neil Gaiman, someone who famously writes comics. I mean, it feels like comics are almost part of like the connective tissue of pop culture because like people like you or the other creators who are making them today grew up on them. Do you feel like that's a common thread?
I do. Certainly, if you talk to a lot of creators that are in the space, comics seem to be the tie that binds us all. And because comics really aren't a part of today's world in the same way, you have to go to a comic shop to
Right.
get comics. They're not everywhere. And seemingly as a kid, they were everywhere. Every drugstore, every liquor store, every convenience store had grocery stores, they had comics.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're this niche thing. So, keeping them alive really is up to guys who are in their 20s to 30s and 40s more so than kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those of us who grew up on them, being able to tell stories now that speak to that fanboyism of our youth, is sort of an honor. And you can see it you can see when you connect with a fanboy in the professional space because you start talking the language, just like how we started talking about Neal or this person or that person, and someone clicks. If you're from that Bronze Age period, and I'm talking about Mike Grell or Jim Starlin or Bernie Wrightson or any of the guys that I grew up with,
Mm-hmm.
and I find a fellow fanboy, we could talk for days. So it's a way to stay young, I guess, too.
It is kind of amazing how that unlocks people. It's like a secret code, except for it's not that secret. It's just like this thing that was a huge deal, but you always wanted to, you just always want to talk about your passions, and that's a commonality. But, that leads us to Killadelphia, your series with Jason Shawn Alexander. Now, your colorist, Luis, how do you pronounce
Luis NCT.
NCT, okay. Luis NCT, Marshall Dillon, Greg Tumbarello, Shannon Bailey, Brent Ash, and Jordan Butler. I'm going to give this solicit really quick so people know the general gist of it. But when a small town beat cop comes home to bury his murdered father, the revered Philadelphia detective James Sangster Sr., he begins to unravel a mystery that leads him down a path of horrors that will shake his beliefs to the core. The city that was once the symbol of liberty and freedom has fallen prey to corruption, poverty, unemployment, brutality, and vampires. It's a great series. I was telling you before we started recording that I really enjoyed it. And it has a lot going on with it. And I want to start with its origins. I know this is something you've recounted quite a bit. You even recounted it in the back of the first trade. But I do think it's funny. One of the things that I was thinking of as I was reading, let's say, we'll get to him in a second, but the surprise head of the vampires,
Mm-hmm.
when I was reading it, I was like, I feel like this is related to Hamilton in some way. And I wasn't totally wrong. So
No.
what was the origin of Killadelphia, and how it feels like one of those things you've been sitting on for a long time?
It is. I think The original origin started when I was a kid and I saw Kolchak the Night Stalker um, with Darren McGavin, and they were written by the late great Richard Matheson. They were movies of the week, and the first one dealt with this journalist that's on the trail of a vampire in Las Vegas, and it just it grabbed me. And then shortly thereafter, the Salem's Lot miniseries, uh, I watched that, and so on and so forth. I kept being inundated and greatly entertained by vampires, and then I started reading them. I read Dracula and the Salem's Lot book and the Anne Rice books, and I never saw my culture really depicted in a way. Even though I enjoyed Blackula a great deal when my mother took me to see him when I was a kid, it didn't have the same degree of depth that the Hammer films had, or some of the earlier stuff. So as a kid, I started thinking, if I were to ever write a vampire story, what would it be like? What would it feel like? And I was working through stories throughout my life, different tones, different styles. Where would he be? What would it be? When I first came to LA in '95, I wrote the film version of it and almost got it sold. And, it was far different than the Killadelphia comic, but it has some similar characters. And I always felt like something was missing. And the two biggest things that were missing for me were the personal part, the part that felt like it was an entry point emotionally into the story. And that's the father-son dynamic, and the other part was, what's the hook that can speak to the past in a very specific way? And I went to Hamilton. I've seen Hamilton a lot. We're in our 20s now. That they can see the 23 or 24 times that I've seen Hamilton. And when the king made fun of John Adams, and John Adams wasn't even in the play,
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, what if John Adams was sitting in the audience and, we're talking about American history and the founding fathers and all of that, and he isn't even relevant enough to be part of, this bigger idea of the spectacle of America, the formation of America. And I was thinking his feelings would be hurt. And if he played it all the way out, he wasn't Thomas Jefferson, or we don't treat him like we treat Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, or even his son, John Quincy Adams. And so that resentment felt like it was something that I could play off of, that I could build that sense of resentment to give him a human quality beyond the bigger idea of what he does for the vampire plan of things.
Mm-hmm. I love how it feels like this is something that happens a lot of times with writers, is that it's like you have these disparate threads in your head. You have this one from the Night Stalker, and then and then you see Hamilton, and you think about this John Adams one, and it's like, how do you pair those two together? I mean, it wasn't even like that. It was probably just, it started growing in your head, and you were like, oh, these two match up well. Mm-hmm. Do you find that that's often where your ideas come from, where it's actually several other ideas married together to kind of strengthen each other?
Very much so. I mean, I think anything that I've written that I'm really, really proud of, there's something intrinsically in me that I'm trying to express. Because if I understand how it feels emotionally, I feel like I can make the reader understand that emotion as well, and hopefully grab them in a very specific way. So there's the plot version of, I'm John Adams and I want to change America. And then there's the emotional aspect of being in a marriage that's not exactly a marriage anymore between him and Abigail.
Yeah.
And also feeling like time hasn't treated me fairly, so I feel slighted in some way. If you give me the right emotions, I can take those emotions and connect them to other emotions and other characters and sort of build a story around all of this character stuff. And then I just need to find a progression that comes with plot. But that's sort of how it works in my head.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I should note for listeners, we will get into like some, slight spoilers with this stuff. But I do, I did want to bring up Abigail Adams because, one of the tricky things is, you want to find when it comes to vampire stories, there's been so many of them. You have to find ways to differentiate them, to set them apart. And also, I mean, I always think that you need to find a hook when it comes to the immortal undead life that would be slightly different because there's, you mentioned like Anne Rice, like that's somebody who has her own version of what vampires are like. And everyone's kind of got their own flavor. And one of the things that I really loved that you did, which was actually kind of a really harsh burn on John Adams, but his quiet sadness over his wife, Abigail's reading of the till death do you part aspect of marriage.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that, they're dead means that she can do whatever she wants. And it's interesting to see. Like, I feel like some of that stuff is a different approach than you normally see from vampire stories when it comes to the immortal element of it, because a lot of times it's all about like, the Baroque lifestyle, the, freedom to do whatever you want. But John was still and it kind of fits the story too. John was still looking at the world in the same way he always looked at it, despite the fact that he'd been around for forever. Did you have fun trying to find ways to differentiate the vampire aspects of the story and how those would affect / curse the people who have eternal life?
Yes and no. The yes part of it was, when I said I wanted to do a vampire story, everybody said no, because we'd seen so many vampire stories. And even if you make a lot of the vampires black, what's the difference? It's just now, what do vampires do?
Right.
They suck blood. Even if they do it in a creepy way or funny way or whatever, at the end of the day, they want blood, and they either make vampires or kill people in the name of getting blood. And my thought was, if I make it about trauma and immortality, the same way a lot of in therapy and Freudian concepts, a lot of trauma in our childhood carries on to adulthood. And my thought was, what if we were to take the trauma that came with being a human being and put it into the immortal, and they had to walk with that trauma throughout time, and to humanize in a different way, in a psychological way, that the things like in a couple of the books, I do backstories on some of the vampires, and they all have these histories that were traumatic, and John Adams found them at just the right time to bring them into his fold. But it was usually when life was, giving them a pretty good beatdown.
Right.
And even though now they've been armed with perspective and immortality, they still have that echo of who they used to be when they were people.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of this came from, I didn't know my father when I was growing up. I'd met him a few times as a child, but I went to live with him when I was 17 years old, and we didn't really get along. We didn't hit it off, and we separated again, and he passed away. And I always wondered, if we had more time, and I gotten older and he gotten older, would we have been able to mend our rift? And I played that out with the father-son story in the book. Just because you have more time, it doesn't necessarily mean things are going to get better. It really is a byproduct of two people being committed to making things work. And I think in Sangster Sr.'s case, he's actually a better person dead than he was alive.
Right.
And, that there's a degree of regret, because now he can reflect, because he really doesn't have a life anymore, but he has the consciousness and he has the memory of the things that he's done in his past that he still has to, he still feels guilty about. He still feels guilt and shame about. And that was the cathartic part for me. And I felt like if executed properly, it could be the cathartic part for other people too, who read the book. And that was the departure for me. There's a couple of books like The Delicate Dependency and a few others that deal with vampires from a different place. But I'd never seen one that sort of infused pop culture as well into the book. So there wasn't necessarily just a slow burn. It felt like a true sense of genre in vampire, like in the traditional sense. But it had this other element to where the vampires felt different. I remember trying to, when I pitched this to Jason, And to my manager, they were both like, dude, vampires. I mean, come on, what can you do differently? And I kept pleading. I was like, just look at the execution. I'm going to execute it differently. It's like, but they're still going to have like fangs and they're still going to bite people. Yes, that'll still happen. But there's this other thing. And I think that's the thing that makes it feel, for the people who dig it, it's the sense that the horror is connected more to the trauma of the vampire himself, more so than just what the vampire is doing.
Absolutely. I mean, that really, especially in the second arc, like you were saying, you get into some of the backstory, especially for the people that are on Abigail Adams' side. It's like, you go into Toppy's backstory and like what he went through in Deadwood and with his family and everything like that. I mean, those are the types of things that, Immortal Life sounds pretty good, except for if you're coming from a point of tragedy. And then at that point, like you said, it just becomes trauma that you carry with yourself forever, and it colors everything you do.
It becomes part of your identity. And I think I studied some psychology, and I had my own therapist, and we were talking about it one time. I was just picking her brain about how the human mind works. And more often than not, there's an event that happens in life that sort of begins this identity of how you see yourself in the world. And in Killadelphia, I wanted to use that as sort of a marker that everybody had an incident, they had a moment where the trajectory of their life had been thrown off by some really messed up event and how they decided to deal with it. There's a line that I have when John Adams is in Purgatory about how we're all flawed, but it's how we deal with our flaws. Like some people define themselves by their flaws, and some people are aware that they're flawed and they work on their flaws to get better. And to me, that's the difference between our vampires. You have some who are just hell bent on power and destruction and really just venting to humanity, kind of punishing humanity for what was done to them so long ago. And then there are the others who are trying to sort of work with humanity in a way and become the best versions of themselves. And it's a delicate walk between the two. And it's the thing that keeps them, that dance is the thing that sort of keeps the book going. If I can keep introducing characters who kind of speak to that math, I think it'll continue to be interesting.
I just want to say that I told you before we started recording that when I was reading the book, I kept sending myself emails of things I, just thought were good notes. And I wrote down that line about flaws. That was a really good line.
Thank you. Again, I have to give it up to my therapist. When she said it, it's sort of for anyone who's sort of infected with guilt and shame, and they beat themselves up and they overthink, like I tend to do. It sort of puts it in perspective that, you're not the only one. Stephen King has a book, Dr. Sleep. Mm-hmm. And there's a moment in the book, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book or seen the movie. It's not so much in the movie, but it is in the book, where the older Danny Torrance has done this thing that he's really ashamed of, and he's afraid to admit it in AA. And he finally does it, and nothing happens. Like no one really reacts in the way that he thought that they would react, because everybody in the room had done something. Mm-hmm. Everybody was there. Everybody carried something. And I think, when I look out at the world today and I see so much anger and such a lack of empathy, and empathy is a tough one. I think insecurity, fear, all of those words, they create their own sort of unique narcissism. To where you're working so hard to protect yourself so that you don't feel that again, that it's really hard to relate to other human beings. So it makes that bridge that we try to cross as a society, for those that try to cross it, it makes it hard for us to build bonds and build relationships in a really healthy way. And I wanted to infuse, taking that sentiment of that line that we were talking about, I wanted to use that sort of as a metaphor for the world that we live in today, but also with what the characters in this book are going through at that time.
Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick second to give a shout out to my friends at Bad Idea. You may have heard of this experimental new comic book publisher. They're the crew that debuted recently in select comic shops worldwide with Matt Kint and Doug Braithwaite's ENIAC #1. And they did that a little differently than their peers. First, each issue is oversized and ad-free. Second, each issue comes with a bonus B-side story, giving readers a little something extra with each issue. Lastly, and this is the wild part, so listen up, they don't publish variants, trades, or digital versions of their comics, so if you want one or all of them, you better get to the Bad Idea retailer near you and be there on a Wednesday. Don't have one near you? Order online or explore your options for mail order at badideacorp.com to make sure you don't miss out on ENIAC or upcoming titles from creators like Zeb Wells, David LaFuente, Marguerite Bennett, and many more. And now, back to the show. I know you mentioned earlier that this is something you'd almost successfully made into a movie before, and that you looked into other fields and you brought into comics. But I do want to say, like, I know it's easy to say this given the fact that the first and only way I've experienced the story so far has been through comics, but I really like I know you've done other comics before, but your ability and your sense of the moment with specific beats is really impressive. I mean, I know working with Shawn Alexander is obviously like a performance enhancing drug in that regard because he's just so phenomenal at it. But I want to give a shout out to the ending of the first issue, which is just an absolute classic final page hook where, again, spoilers, but it's like you mentioned the father is turned into a vampire, and he is like basically like, little did you know, the entire time he's just been waiting in the grave as a vampire, and he says, "What took you so long, boy?" And it was working off of Jimmy, his son's own trauma and his memories of what happened when his mother passed away, and it was just like this absolutely perfect moment. And I don't know, I mean, that's the tough thing with if you just had that idea of the flaws and working through all that trauma and stuff, and you didn't have the execution to back it up, it wouldn't hit as hard. And I don't know. I mean, I'm very impressed by how well you've taken to the pacing and rhythms of comics. It's really well done.
Thank you. I think a lot of that has come through trial and error. Big thanks to Marvel Comics for giving me my first shot at writing comics. When I first started my first series with a short-lived series, Falcon, with Marvel in 2017, I think, I had to learn pacing. I had to learn today's pacing. I had to learn what my voice in comics was. I struggled. Certainly the first 3 issues, I struggled mightily. And I sort of began to get my rhythm around issue 4. And what I did was I asked myself, why am I writing this differently than I would a TV show? Why am I trying to do something different? Like, when I write movies and TV shows, I sort of write them the same. One is a singular experience and the other is an ongoing experience. And, my style is my style. But with comics, I was trying to do a different thing. I don't know why, but I think it was connected to my love of comics and, wanting people to like it and a lot of other things. And so once I started to write it the way that I would normally write it, it felt comfortable. It felt like something that I knew, so my confidence would grow. And, I've done 3 or 4 series before Killadelphia, and I look at them all as sort of being like boot camp for me to go through trial and error and figure out what I do well and what, folks respond to. And I'm just really, really glad that Killadelphia wasn't my first attempt, because I don't think it would have come out the way that it's come out today.
I mean, that's one of the weird things about comics. I guess it is kind of the same for everything, but when you talk to people in comics, they say the only way to figure out how to make comics is to make comics. And
oh yeah,
it's like you're, I don't know, learning on the job.
Well, you start off like in the Dark Night of the Soul. Like if you're going through the hero's journey, you don't do any of that other stuff. You start going through the part that's really, really difficult. And, Lord willing, you come out on the other side in a better place. But for me, it was struggle. It's still a degree of a struggle, but it's different now. I start each one of these issues with a theme. Mm-hmm. And I try to carry that theme. That theme is sort of the tie that bonds, whether it's anger, love, forgiveness. There's usually one word that I say, okay, anger, what's this issue going to be about? And each of the stories, I usually do a big A story, a medium-sized B story, and sort of a C runner, like I would in an episode of television. And I try to tie them all by that singular theme. And I'll probably keep doing it that way until it runs out. I run out of words, or I start repeating words. But yeah.
I think the funny thing is in some ways, I mean, I know this in itself is a police show, or a police comic, but it reminds me, I grew up, I was like a weird kid who was like, everyone else is like watching cartoons, and I really liked like Law and Order and like Homicide. And
stop.
What?
Did you say Homicide, like Homicide on the Street?
Life on the Street? Yeah.
That's my favorite show of all time.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah. I was like,
I would love for Andre Braugher to be James Sangster Sr.
Oh my God, he'd be so amazing.
We could talk for another hour.
But I mean, the thing about that though is like, I feel like, you were talking about how you were trying to write the way that you thought you should write comics. And you were fighting the way that you knew how you like to write. And in some ways, it's like those themes you were doing were almost like the procedural element of like the case of the week. And like, I know that's like an imperfect comparison, but I mean, at the same time, it's like you need that structure because it makes each issue stand out on its own while still fitting within the larger narrative. That's one thing I always appreciate about those shows, is it all meshed together through those individual elements.
Well, certainly Homicide. I mean, Homicide was so different than anything up until that point. I grew up with watching a lot of those 1 hour procedurals, Columbo, Rockford Files, all that stuff with my grandfather. And Homicide had this feeling like from week to week, you never knew what you were going to get. You knew you were going to get a homicide,
right?
But you never knew how it was going to play out. And that's very, very much a part of what I'm doing here. I think certainly the way you got into each detective's head and the emotions that were under them, like these folks really, they had jokes and stuff when they were at the crime scene, but throughout that hour, you saw them becoming more and more emotionally connected to the case.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of when I do the police stuff in the series, I'm speaking to that, because that's still, I haven't seen a lot of great cop shows. Nothing has topped Homicide to this point. And I still sort of, that's my way of expressing my appreciation of that, and how Tom Fontana and Barry Levinson and those guys did it.
Yeah. It is interesting seeing that paired with that kind of feel paired with the horror elements. Like I did see in another interview that you liked John Carpenter growing up. And that made a ton of sense to me, because one thing I really enjoy about Killadelphia is it just feels like there's this looming tension throughout the story, particularly in the first arc. But it's just like, I don't know. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, where it's like it's like this pervasive, like unsettling nature to it, where it's not just when the fights are going, attacks are going on or anything like that. It's just like, it feels like something's always about to go down. And that's a tough feel to convey in comics. I have friends who don't believe that horror comics work very well because you don't have this, the music and the ambiance and all this stuff. But I think you really nail it here.
Thank you. A lot of that is Jason.
Yeah.
A lot of that is his ability. We talk about each issue after I write the script, and he knows that I dig that kind of the flashlights in the alley, what you saw in Seven and True Detective, and a little bit in Homicide. I like that feeling that something could jump out at any moment, mm-hmm. and get you. And because we're dealing with one city, and we're dealing with something that primarily comes out at night, and we're afraid of things that go bump in the night because we can't see them. We don't know where they're coming from. So being able to take that primal fear of dealing with darkness and to give it some sense of tension, close alleyways, mm-hmm. When Sangster is in Hell Hall and he's walking around, he doesn't know where they're coming from, and a couple comes through the window. I always wanted it to feel like there was that omnipresent sense of tension and danger. And I feel like sometimes when I see horror films or horror TV shows today, they don't necessarily have that. They have a very similar, the music, like you were saying, your friend was expressing, the music sort of tells you something's about to happen, so you pay closer attention and then the thing happens. I wanted to create an entire environment where at any moment anything could happen. And because you don't have those other elements to sort of do some of the work for you, I have to bring you into a scene with tension and emotion. And then the emotion sort of drives when you're going to get something that's horrific. But you have to set that in a place where you don't exactly know when that's going to happen in order to make it feel spontaneous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I do want to talk about the rest of the team, and we'll start with Jason because obviously, as you noted, like the tension and everything else. I mean, even like I love seeing his process in the back of the first trade and seeing how he was using photo reference to make these relationships and these characters feel real. Because he I mean, the relationship between, especially, I mean, James's face, like the way that Jason can bring that to life is so incredible. But what made him the right fit for this story?
Well, it was a process because I was hired to do an interview with Jason for an art book, maybe about 5 years ago, and we live a mile and a half apart from each other, so we sort of hit it off during that interview, and we started to go to dinner together. And invariably, I wanted to do comics. He was doing comics. He would pitch me his ideas. I would pitch him my ideas, and we both hated each other's ideas. And one night I'm pitching him Killadelphia, and I don't see hatred, going across his face. I don't see his eyes glazing over. And he started nodding like, yeah, tell me more, tell me more. And we had a couple more dinners, and I kept pitching, and I kept pitching, and I kept pitching. And then one night I said, it's Hamilton meets Sanford and Son meets Dracula. And he said, I got it. That's the one we should do together. And that sort of was the thing. And in between, while we're having these dinners, I would go to his house and, like a lot of artists, Jason's house looks like a museum. He has all of his work, just like paintings, these beautiful paintings hanging everywhere. And there was this sense of dread in a lot of them. There was this sadness that was there. And that's what I wanted to give the people and the vampires in the series. I wanted them to have this sense of dread because, the nature of their lives before they became vampires wasn't the best. And after they're vampires, they're still kind of haunted with the thing that they had when they were human beings. And so my thought was, if I could write well enough to inspire Jason to convey the emotion that I see in his artwork, I think we would have something really special going there. So that's sort of what brought us together, and me continuously begging Jason to do lots of things that he doesn't always want to do. But when you see those double page spreads, like there's this one where angels are above and demons are below, and Sangster's in the casket just wishing he could go to one side or the other. That's me wanting to see Jason draw things. Like sometimes I'll write to what I want to see Jason draw because I'm such a Shawn Alexander fan, just, regardless if we were doing the book. I love his art.
Yeah.
So there you go.
I mean, the appreciation of his art, it probably helps because you kind of know what his strengths and his capabilities are, so you can write towards that.
Oh, yeah. And it's all emotion. It's all, like you said, the facial expressions. Like every book will have 2 or 3 pages where it's just talking heads, and making that interesting and not slowing the book down. I got to do a couple of things, but all of those things that I do as a writer depend on him as an artist. If it's something that's sarcastic or passive aggressive, that's got to come through not just in the words, but in the expression. Usually it's from Sangster Sr. It's got to land in a very particular way because it's the punchline oftentimes to the page that's going to take you into the next scene. And so Jason's ability to do that, like I said, I write to it because I love the way that he does it. But even before I was writing specifically to it the way that I do now, he was doing it already. I just felt like, I could help him more by making it easier for him. But he's great. Do
you kind of leave page layout decisions at least somewhat to him?
all of it's to him. We started in the beginning. I remember he said, dude, when you write the script, unless it's a splash page or whatever, you don't have to tell me what to do. And the way he said it, I heard what was under it, like that thing of, I got this, there was a confidence that was there. And so I really just put the information that I'd like to see on the page, and he interprets it in a way that works best for him. And so far, 12 issues in, I've never been disappointed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the funny thing is, I had Brian Michael Bendis on the podcast last year, and we were talking about his career, and he was telling me about early on in his career where he'd be writing, detailed like page layouts and things like that, and he'd be working with people like Alex Maleev. Alex Maleev, who's, I actually feel like Jason's got a lot of his art, like there's a lot of stylistic comparisons there, but and he was just really overwriting, and I think at a certain point, like Alex was just like, you don't need to do that. And I mean, that's one of the things though, is like, that's, you're still feeling your way out, and having somebody that's like a vet like Jason who really knows it. I mean, that's the way to bring the best out of the comic.
Yeah, I mean, he has actually made me better. He's made me a better writer of comics, certainly working with him than I was before I was working with him. And that has nothing to do with every artist. I've been blessed with every artist, Josh Cassara, Paolo Villanelli, Selena Espiritu. They've all been fantastic. But there's something about the personal nature of being able to be in Jason's face on a regular basis before COVID. Now we're on the phone and we have text fights every other day. But something about the intimacy of it, of being able to go back and forth in the way that we do, and the story being so personal to both of us, has helped me evolve and figure out how to do this better.
Now, whose idea were Mulder and Scully?
I have no idea what you mean. You mean those two FBI detectives that came in that time?
I mean,
at the governor's office. Those two detectives, those two agents, excuse me, of the FBI that handle special cases, who look a lot like Mulder and Scully. I would have to say that that was my idea. As was the reporter who was asking the question, whose first name was Carl. Mm-hmm. There's another one that people did not get. The guy who brought the caskets to Toppy and Deadwood, he was another one.
Was it a Deadwood character?
No. His first name is Anton. It's from, there was a Dr. Phibes, Vincent Price. But Jason and I decided after the first one that anytime we could do an homage to the stuff that we loved, and it felt right, we would stick it in there kind of like an Easter egg or Easter chicken that was going to deliver an egg or something. But, we're both big, long time horror fans. And so anytime you can stick in the stuff that inspired you, we always try to get it in there.
I loved it. It was great. But, I do want to comment too on, I think one of the tricky parts with having a story that has as much of a personal feel as this one does, like especially with the Jimmy and James Sangster's relationship, like you really need to have it all connect. And especially in that first issue where you have, Jason doing his tremendous character work, and then Marshall having like the letter that James is writing, the handwritten, font that he's using. That gives it a very personal feel, but I feel like that kind of carries on throughout. Like it has this holistic feel. Was that something that was really important to you from the start, or is that kind of the type of thing that just shook out as you were working with these pros?
No, it was. I knew it needed to feel personal in order for it to land. Something that I discovered in television. You look at the stuff that matters. More often than not, it's things that feel personal. Like I love Breaking Bad, and I could relate to Heisenberg or Walter White's frustrations with life. And, going back to Homicide from a couple of moments ago, there was a similar thing with Frank Pemberton as well. to where, his anger and his frustration, and it just felt very personal. Even if you couldn't necessarily relate to the specific thing that he was talking about or dealing with, you could relate to what was under it. And I felt like if I could do that with, there are three entry points into Killadelphia. There's the father-son relationship, there's the marriage or lack thereof between John and Abigail, and then there's Seesaw's character, who sort of represents the street and, the voice of the oppressed. And each one of those three, I bring them together and I take them apart. But I wanted each one of those to feel personal. I wanted them to have some human characteristic, whether it was Seesaw and his grandmother, and that represented generational pain. How, more often than not, there's some people who say trauma can be passed down through DNA. But I think in the case of poverty, it sort of does make an imprint of self-esteem and self-worth. And that was sort of Seesaw's cross to bear and what his grandmother was dealing with. With Abigail and John, it was their marriage and patriarchy that, Abigail was a brilliant woman from everything that I've read, and, raised a bunch of scholars with their kids, and they all went on to be government officials and to do really, really well. And John wasn't seen as being the same thing, but Abigail came up in a time where women were really being, oppressed. And so she had to take a back seat. And my thinking was the frustration and the resentment that was built having to make that move. She still carries that. And it's not necessarily, I won't say John's fault, but he benefited from it. And that has seeped into their marriage. And so even though they have this new dynamic where they're immortals and, they're cool and they've got this plan and everything's working, it's still John's plan. And Abigail is there sort of facilitating it in the same way that she did their marriage. And so that felt real, frustration and tension within a marriage. And then back to where we started with James Jr. and Sr., to where they had very obvious, from that first issue, very visceral, very grounded differences. And, the referee, which was Jimmy's mother, James's wife, when she passes away, they don't have the referee anymore. It's just the two of them to fight it out and figure it out. And so I wanted each one of those to feel personal, and I wanted them to feel real. And I just had to find the right plot devices, the right, the right rhythms in order to be able to tell those stories where I felt like they resonated best.
Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick second to give a shout out to Macroverse. Macroverse is an exciting digital comics platform that makes next-gen comics custom crafted for your phone. Macroverse's comics utilize its unique tap story format, which ensures this isn't a PDF on an iPad or an endless scroll, but a designed for mobile experience where every episode is crafted to take advantage of this one-of-a-kind style. Macroverse is curated for quality, with every series they publish being something they believe deserves to be read by a massive audience. Think of it like HBO for comics, with over 35 titles and 400 episodes from names like Brian Stelfreeze, Juan Doe, Paul Scheer, and more. Check out Macroverse today by downloading the app on iOS or Google Play and get started with a rotating collection of free episodes, or unlock the entire universe for just $4.99 a month, with half of all profits going to the creators themselves. And now, back to the show. Yeah, I Seesaw in particular, I have to say, like, some of those moments in his first scene with his grandma are just, oh my God, Jason's like character acting in that is just unbelievable. It's like heartbreaking just to see him. And I don't know, I love that character because relative to the other two sides, he's like the third side. He's like the wild card that sees two sides who want to maintain some sort of system, and he just wants the system to be gone.
Because he's been the one that's actually been oppressed by the system.
Right.
And so for him, regardless if you make the system better, it's still the same system. It's still it's connected to the same thing. And even if it were the greatest system ever, he's lost trust in the idea of systems. And what's the point when you're immortal? What's the point when, all of the fears and concerns that you had as a human being have been taken off the table? So why would I have to, sit around a room with folks and do this thing that we did like we did when we were human beings. It makes no sense. John's holding on to, the antiquated idea of what it means to be part of what he was a part of. And Abigail to a lesser degree, but she's still a part of that too. But with Seesaw, it's more of, dude, I've never tasted freedom before.
Right.
I've never been free, and now I have all of this power. I want to feel what that's like, and I don't necessarily have to become nefarious in order to get the most out of that. I can just be me.
Well, I just have a few more questions. I did want to bring up one part of the team that I really think is, especially in the trades, is super underrated. The design side. You had Brent Ash do the logo design and Jordan Butler do the graphic design. The trades look amazing. I mean, I don't know if you ever read the other an image series named Black Monday Murders by Jonathan Hickman and Tom Coker. But
I read the first couple. They were that was dense. They were really dense, but
very dense. The design kind of reminds me of that though, in like the way that I think it was Jordan that did it. But I mean, that's a very underrated aspect of making a memorable comic book, is like having it all feel like a holistic, aesthetic art piece, and like that fits so well. I mean, I'm looking at the third chapter break right now, and it's like John Adams with fangs, and it has Abaddon on there, and it says it's calling me like I belong here. And like, I don't know, I mean, why was that something you wanted to include? Because it's something a lot of people sleep on when it comes to comics.
Well, a lot of it was Brent and Jason working together. I mean, I saw all of it, and it all came across my desk, but I trusted Brent was really great at what he does for us, and just in general. I mean, his designs and his choices were fantastic from the beginning. And Jason always has that sort of that. Dave McKean was a big influence on both of us, and the way he did the Sandman covers and the Miracle Man covers, and we always wanted to feel that eclectic style. And I think Brent did a great job at just being able to frame that in such a way that it had an air of distinction to it. And, a shameless plug for the Volume 2 trade that's coming out in a couple of weeks. It's such a beautiful book in the way that those guys design it that even if I wasn't a part of it, I would be intrigued because, and the covers, the variant cover artists as well. But to what you're speaking to specifically, the way those guys assembled this book is, it's mind blowing to me.
Yeah. Well, as you said, the second trade is coming out in a few weeks. You have a new arc coming in May. So there's more to come for Killadelphia, which makes sense because I'm not going to get into spoilers for this, but you had quite the ending point for the second trade. But
yes.
I'm curious, like, do you have a finite vision for where you want this story to go? Or is it something that you could keep pushing forward if support is there?
I want to keep pushing forward. I think it has to evolve. There's not so much the Walking Dead comic that I love, but there were times in the Walking Dead series where I felt like, I was just waiting for another big bad to come.
Right.
And if I get to a place where I'm starting to repeat themes, or I can no longer, the first wow factor is with Jason. He made a Twitter post not long ago where he was thinking, we've done 2 good arcs, and I'm really happy with them, and they turned out great, and the fans dig them. No way we can do a third. And then he read the first script for the third arc, and he used a lot of profanity. He was in a positive way. And if I can't get that out of him, I think it's time for us to put this thing to bed. In a TV show, you can do a slow burn and you can last forever. You get to that magic 100 episode place. When it comes to something like this, because you're really dealing with a passionate base, comics aren't television. And so you always want to be in a place where you're able to keep the team passionate about what we're doing. Like, we know why we're in this. And so whether it was the backup story of Elysium Gardens in the back of the book, or a bunch of other stories and that we want to tell, as long as it feels fresh, we'll keep going.
Yeah, I mean, Jason's your first reader. If you can't get him excited, you're going to be in a tough time.
Yes, and I'm thinking that as I'm sitting and I'm writing, I'm always thinking, how can I push him? And that's like the sign of a real artist when that push is there. When he wants to be, he wants you to pull the best out of him. And that's always, of all the stuff that I do in TV and film and whatever, impressing Jason Shawn Alexander every month is like the biggest hill to climb.
Do you feel like as you're working more in comics and you're learning more about it, and especially as you get further into a series where you have like this ongoing narrative going, like you have to keep pushing yourself to push the boundaries to make sure that you're not, like you're figuring this medium out, but you're not settling when it comes to the storytelling. Is that something you're really conscious of?
I'm always conscious of it because it's a very specific way of telling a story. So if I switch up, for sake of, if it became more plot driven and it became more like a mainstream book, I don't think it would kind of land in the same way. So I'm always looking for how can I tell the story in a way that, before it moves Jason, it's got to move me.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to find things that are really, really personal to be able to speak to. And I usually sit down and I think beyond, where we left off at the end of volume 2, what am I going to do with that? But how can I speak to the reality of what we're dealing with as a society in a larger way? I remember in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, Saga of the Swamp Thing, I couldn't wait to get those books. Like, I love that series. That's my favorite series of all time. And there was that initial run with Arcane that that I thought was fantastic. And then he got into what we call now Justice League Dark. But it always seemingly came back to Swamp Thing and Abby in the swamps together, intimately dealing with love and all of that stuff. Beauty and the Beast, I guess you could say. And when we were talking earlier about, the cop procedural aspect of Killadelphia, I never wanted to get too big to where you can't have that.
Right.
To where there can't be those intimate moments in an alley with a guy with a flashlight and a gun trying to figure out how he's going to get out of this or trying to discover something. That's important. And it's sort of why I made the choice between volumes 1 and 2 to, we're 6 months ahead. Vampires are kind of the new normal. There are conspiracy theorists who believe that they were vampires. There are others, the story is they were terrorists. There's something about the intimacy of that I dig when it becomes like, it's vampires everywhere and you can't go outside and, they've taken over the whole world. That's kind of not what this is.
Right.
It'll always be an intimate story, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the procedural element is like your foundation. You want to keep that, but you want to keep improvising from there.
Exactly.
Well, just a couple of comic related questions, broader comic related things. One of the things I think is really interesting about comics, I'm not like this, I do want to assure you, is how whenever someone who's had previous success in another field gets involved, some fans get kind of like weird and almost territorial, or at the very least, they aren't totally familiar with the backgrounds of these people, so it's almost like you're starting over at square one. Mm-hmm. With comics, did you feel like, to a certain degree, you need to prove yourself all over again in this field, or is that not the kind of thing that enters your brain?
I still do.
Yeah.
And that comes from the fanboy place. I'm very, I look at the comics community as being sacred. The part that works, the good part. I never want to do anything that, sort of diminishes what the love of this art form is. And so there's something cool about it, though, the level of vulnerability of making something, putting it out there, and, leaving it up to the world to give you their raw opinions, immediately about it. You get that in TV, but you can hide in TV. You can make a TV show and the TV show gets judged. Very rarely do they attack the writer or, the director in the same way that a comic, in a comic, they say they hate the art, or I hate the writing.
Right,
and
right.
It's immediate. And, for me, it's just more of, there's a humbling journey of trying to win over the hearts and minds of comic readers and starting over again. It's kind of cool in a way.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool just to be able to start it at zero and just do your best. And it's not easy because there's so much product out there, so many indie books. You're competing with the big two. You're competing with history. You're dealing with a book where a lot of the characters are characters of color. So there's a preconceived idea about what it's going to be. So you have to wrestle with that as well.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot that you're going up against, but it's still it's a worthy task to me.
Yeah. I mean, comics are very interesting because, like you're saying, compared to other mediums, they're very naked because you're not part of this massive team. You are the team in some ways. And that can be really tough. I think it's funny though, because the only show I can really think of that had like the comic level of connection to the writers and directors was like Game of Thrones. And like that one, it was just like people very specifically either loved them or hated them depending on their performance. And it was the most comic book like TV show that's ever existed, despite the fact that it was just this massive production. But I do want to say though, I mean, I love that, you launched Zombie Love Studios, which is a studio that grounds horror and reality in the form of graphic novels, because it's like, I don't know. I mean, it really kind of underlines that, you're not that you have to be, but that you're kind of in this for the long haul. You love comics and you want to keep making them.
Yeah, and there were stories that I wanted to tell that were very specific, that I really didn't want anyone else's hands in them unless they were, part of the team. And our team is really much of the same team that you mentioned from, that's the Killadelphia team. The Zombie Love team is the same folks. And, when you go through a publisher and you have to pitch the publisher and the publisher's got to say, and, some of those stories are, how can I say this? They're the types of stories that you don't have anything else to compare them to.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have that, it's always an uphill climb, because when someone's marketing something, they like to say, oh, it's just like The Shining, or it's just like, this or that, or
the
whatever.
elevator pitch.
Yeah, it's always that. And if you're doing it yourself, and, because I've been fortunate enough to have some semblance of a name in TV and film, it gives me a little bit more of a higher profile than just a guy who decided to get into comics yesterday and, is putting out a book. There's some interest that's there, because of the possibilities of what it could be. So I decided to kind of leverage that and tell some stories that I really want to tell in a very specific way.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last question I have for you has nothing to do with comics. I mean, one of the things I really like about Killadelphia is it really does feel like a passion project, in the sense that this is something you've long wanted to do, both in the story, but also in the fact that you just love comics. It comes across in the work. I am interested in, you are writing and executive producing an HBO series about the Showtime Lakers based off Jeff Pearlman's book. And I don't want to get into it because I'm sure you can't say anything about the project, but I'm a huge fan of the NBA. I'm interested if like this is a similar level, if this is a passion project too, because like, are you a big basketball guy? Is this like kind of a Neal Adams cover style thing for you?
Yes. It's funny because I'm 6'7", and I was 6'8". My doctor said I'm 6'7" now, so I guess I'm shrinking. And I played basketball growing up, but it was this weird thing. I was a much better fan of the game than I was a player of the game. And I actually embraced basketball a lot like how I embraced comic books. Dr. J, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, those guys were like superheroes to me. And now having an opportunity to tell stories of those very folks, again, in a very specific way, along with Max Bornstein, I think it's the most honest depiction of that, not just basketball, but that entire period of the late 70s, early 80s, because the funny thing with the Lakers is that prominent period was it hit right when cable television was starting to explode, when Reaganomics was coming into play, when celebrity was changing. It was becoming more mainstream. The idea of what it was, and sport sort of accompanied that idea. And so we're not just telling the story of the Lakers just like straight ahead. We're telling the story about all of that stuff that's around it as well. So, we've been writing these scripts for 2 years. Thank you, COVID. And they're really, really layered. And we start shooting. We've already shot the pilot. We start shooting the series in the middle of April. So, we're happy to get it out of our systems and, get it out to America, and hopefully it's received well.
Yeah. I mean, that's the interesting thing about, the Lakers have always been they've always been such a celebrity draw too. I mean, I don't know when Jack Nicholson started going, but it was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And
he's in there too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, I know it's perhaps an imperfect comparison, but you were going to work on vinyl, and it's just like, a lot of times when you have those, when you think of like the Showtime Lakers, you're like, oh, it's just gonna be a cool show about basketball, but it's just like that world is a very rich world. And
oh yeah,
so tonight my team is actually playing the Los Angeles Lakers. I'm an Indiana Pacers fan.
Okay.
Yeah.
You guys have a history back with the ABA all the way through now.
Yeah. And the funny thing is like you said like the Dr. J and all those players were kind of like superheroes to you. To me, I grew up like the thing that made me a 100% Indiana Pacers fan was when Reggie Miller scored 25 points in the fourth quarter against the New York Knicks and then flashed a choke sign at Spike Lee.
Yes.
That moment, I was just like, because Reggie Miller is not like a 7'2" dude. He's not like a ripped physical specimen like Michael Jordan. He was just kind of this lanky guy, and he was doing this thing that nobody does on the biggest stage and doing it with so much attitude. It was kind of like, I don't know, he was like the anti-hero to me. I was just like, I love this guy. It's like if I was on the court doing it. And I don't know, I think I always have felt like the NBA or like basketball in general has like this rich, fertile ground for that type of jumping off point. So I love the fact you're doing this.
That 30 for 30 they did with the Pacers and the Knicks was actually pretty good too.
The winning time one?
Yeah, I enjoyed that. But yeah, I think there's this other aspect too of, the players don't wear helmets. And so you get to see their faces and you get to see the passion, like you were saying with Reggie, and their personalities come out in a very specific way.
Yeah.
And it's just the game of basketball in general. It's so simple yet complex at the same time. But, it's fueled off of passion. Not to say the other sports aren't, but you just feel like it's more intimate than some of the others.
Well, it's like in some ways, it's kind of like the difference between making comics versus making a TV show where it's just you.
Yes.
It's naked.
Yes. It's way. I remember when I first got my assignment at Marvel, and they were like, whatever you want to do. And I'm thinking, I'm not used to that. I'm used to saying what I want to do and someone telling me I can't do that, and I have to make an adjustment to what I can and can't do.
Right.
It's like that's the muscle that I've been trained to kind of work, and being able to just do what I want to do is like, it's liberating in its own way, but I think it helps you define your own voice across the board. When you're a guy in a chair trying to please a network in the studio, you almost become like a sparring partner in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to be in comics and doing it exactly the way you want to do it, I think it gives you it helps fight imposter syndrome a little bit more so as well, because you're doing your thing when it works.
Yeah,
it works. It lands when it lands the way that you want it to land. It can be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, so far so good. Killadelphia, you're totally landing. I'm looking forward to see what you got for us with the Lakers. But Rodney, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Killadelphia, comics, Neal Adams, the Lakers, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time as well.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Rodney Barnes. You can find Barnes on Twitter at the Rodney Barnes and his work in Killadelphia at Image Comics. Love Off Panel and want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating and review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content and its members-only forum. You You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Zach Thompson, Bradley Roeder, Carl Choi, Megan Marston, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Barrow, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Antonio Offen, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Scotty Young, Susanna Polo, Jeff Weir, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Top, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Slade, Sakil Wilson, Alex Demetriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Leona Kingas, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ranwa, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hull, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Carl McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.